The morning Clara Whitmore set the last platter on the long table, Hank Briggs walked in with a sneer already carved into his face and knocked it straight to the floor. Didn't trip, didn't stumble, just looked her dead in the eye and did it on purpose. Eggs, biscuits, and 2 hours of work scattered across the dirt like they were nothing, like she was nothing. Then turned to the men crowding in behind him and said, loud enough for every soul in that room to hear, "Tell the cook to try again. Maybe this time she'll manage something fit for a dog." Nobody laughed. Nobody said a word. And that silence, Clara had learned, was its own kind of cruelty. If this story already has your heart beating faster, hit that like button right now. Drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. And subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Because what happens next to Clara Whitmore is something you will not want to watch alone. The Red Canyon Ranch sat in a stretch of New Mexico territory that the land itself seemed to have given up on. The soil was the color of dried blood, cracked in long splits that ran across the earth like old scars. The wind never stopped. It just changed directions, pushing grit into your eyes, your teeth, the collar of your shirt. What trees existed out there were bent sideways from years of fighting a losing battle, their roots gripping the rock like something that had forgotten how to let go. Clara had arrived on a Tuesday in late September, stepping off a freight wagon with a canvas bag over one shoulder and $18 sewn into the hem of her skirt. She was 23 years old. She had no family left that she knew of, no property, and no particular plan beyond answering the ad she'd found folded inside a church bulletin back in Tucson. Cook wanted, Red Canyon Ranch, New Mexico territory. Room and board provided. Inquiry within. She'd taken it because she was running low on options and because she could cook. That was the honest truth of it. Not because she dreamed of feeding cowboys in the middle of nowhere, but because she was good at it, and good at it meant employed, and employed meant she wasn't sleeping in a livery stable again. The ranch foreman who hired her was a leathery man named Dade Pruitt, who shook her hand exactly once and showed her the kitchen like he was showing her a cell. It was a long, low room attached to the back of the main bunkhouse, with 2 heavy iron stoves, a scarred wooden work table running the full length of one wall, and shelves that sagged under the weight of tin cans and flour sacks. There was a cot in this corner behind a curtain someone had nailed up for privacy, and a single small window that looked out at the back wall of the stable. "Breakfast at 4:30, Pruitt told her. "Dinner at noon, supper at 6. You don't come out of this kitchen unless there's a fire or you're hauling supplies. Men here work hard and they don't need distractions." Clara had nodded. She understood what distractions meant when a man said it that way, looking at her the way Pruitt was looking at her. "What happened to the last cook?" she asked. He'd paused just long enough to be telling. "Left." She didn't push it. She set her bag on the cot, tied on her apron, and got to work. That was nearly 2 years ago now. By the time Hank Briggs knocked that platter onto the floor, Clara had been at Red Canyon long enough to know the names of every man's horse before she knew the men themselves. That was how it worked out there. The horses got called by name: Copper, Duke, Biscuit, Old Swayback. And she got called Hay or Cook, or on the days when the men were in decent moods, nothing at all. She didn't think much about it anymore. That was the honest, ugly truth of it. She had stopped thinking about it because thinking about it didn't change anything, and it took up space she needed for other things. She thought about the restaurant instead. Not this kitchen, not a ranch kitchen with a leaking roof and an oven that ran hot on the left side and cold on the right. A real restaurant. Tables with actual chairs, not split-log benches. A menu she chose herself. Customers who came because they wanted to be there, not because there was nowhere else to eat for 40 miles in any direction. She let herself have that thought most mornings, early, before anyone was up. It was the thing that made the 4:30 wake-up bearable. Then the men would come in, and she'd stop thinking about it. Hank Briggs had been at Red Canyon about 8 months. He'd come up from Texas, or so he said, though Clara had noticed that men from Texas often turned out to be from somewhere less impressive. He was broad through the shoulders, not quite as tall as he carried himself, and he had the kind of confidence that exists only in men who've never been seriously challenged. The other hands gave him room, which was all the invitation a man like that needed to take more than room. He'd started in on Clara about 2 months after he arrived, Small things at first, complaining that the biscuits were too hard, that the coffee was weak, that she'd put too much pepper in the stew. She'd adjusted, because that was the job. Then he'd started commenting on how she moved around the kitchen, and she'd stopped adjusting and started ignoring, because there was a line she'd learned to locate early in any new situation, and he'd crossed it. The ignoring seemed to make it worse. That was also something she'd learned about men like Hank Briggs. They could tolerate almost anything except the possibility that they weren't being registered. The morning with the platter had started like any other. Clara had been up since before 4, working in the dark by lamplight. She'd made eggs scrambled with onion and dried chili because she'd gotten a good price on dried chilies from the supply wagon the week before, and they needed to be used. She'd made salt pork and fried potatoes and a double batch of biscuits because it was a long ride day and the men would be hungry coming in. She'd gotten water on for coffee and laid the table herself because the boy who was supposed to help her in the mornings, a 14-year-old named Gil who was terrified of everything, had been sick for 3 days. It was good food. She knew it was good food the same way she always knew, not with pride, just with the quiet certainty of someone who had been doing this long enough to know the difference between good and adequate. She carried the egg platter out herself, set it in the center of the table, and was turning back for the biscuits when Hank Briggs walked in. He didn't say anything at first. He came in with 3 other men behind him, still wearing his coat, hat still on, and he looked at the table the way a man looks at something he's already decided he doesn't want. Then he looked at Clara. Then, very deliberately, like he was making a point he'd thought about ahead of time, he put his hand on the edge of the platter and pushed it off the table. It didn't clatter. It crashed. That heavy tin ring of it hitting the dirt floor, the eggs going everywhere, the sound bouncing off the low ceiling and dying there. Clara stood still. She had learned the hard way, at other ranches and other kitchens, that the thing you wanted to do in that moment, which was to say something, to meet it directly, to not let it pass, was usually the wrong move. Not because she was wrong to want to say something, but because there were 17 other men about to come through that door who needed breakfast, and Dade Pruitt, who would side with the hand over the cook every time, and zero evidence that standing up for herself in that particular room would produce anything except more trouble. So she stood still and looked at Hank Briggs and didn't say a word. "Tell the cook to try again," he said, loud, turning to the men behind him. "Maybe this time she'll manage something fit for a dog." One of the men, a younger hand named Porter, who wasn't mean himself but was too young and too eager to know the difference between going along and choosing, snorted a half laugh. The other 2 had the good sense to look somewhere else. Clara bent down and started picking up the platter and what could be salvaged. Her knees were on the floor of her own kitchen. She was aware of this. She filed it away in the place where she kept things she needed to remember. Briggs stepped past her like she wasn't there and poured himself coffee. She had the table reset in 14 minutes. New eggs, biscuits still warm, fresh coffee. The men ate. Most of them didn't look at her, and most of them didn't thank her. And one of them, old Peterson, who'd been at Red Canyon since before Pruitt, paused near the kitchen door on his way out and said quietly, not quite meeting her eyes, "Good biscuits this morning." It was the closest thing to acknowledgement she was going to get, and she took it. She spent the rest of the morning scrubbing the platter and thinking about the restaurant, and not about Hank Briggs, because that was the discipline she'd built to keep herself intact out here. You let yourself think about the future, not about the thing that just happened. The thing that just happened was over. The future was still something she could affect. Pruitt came in around 9 and told her they were expecting a new hire the following week. She nodded and asked how many would be at the supper table, and he said the usual, and that was the entirety of the conversation. She found out later from Gil, who was back on his feet by Thursday, pale and thin but functional, that the new man was from a wealthy family, that he wasn't coming as a regular hired hand, that his name was Caldwell. "Caldwell like the Caldwells?" Clara asked. Gil shrugged. He was 14 and from Socorro, and his knowledge of New Mexico ranching dynasties was limited. That's what Pruitt said. Ethan Caldwell. Clara put the name away and didn't think about it much. In her experience, wealthy men arriving at working ranches generally meant one of 2 things. They were in trouble somewhere else and hiding, or they were in some kind of business transaction with the owner, and she was going to be expected to feed them better than usual for whatever duration they stayed. Either way, it wasn't her concern. She went back to the inventory she was taking and added dried beans to the list of things she needed. Ethan Caldwell arrived on a Friday afternoon, and the first thing Clara noticed was that he didn't make any noise about it. She'd expected, based on nothing but pattern, some version of the entrance wealthy men usually made. She'd worked at a ranch outside of Santa Fe where the owner's son would come visiting twice a year, and you always knew it was happening because there'd be shouting from the yard and the sound of a fast horse and 3 or 4 hands running out to look. Wealth tended to announce itself. Men who had it liked to make sure you knew. Ethan Caldwell drove his own wagon in. Brown horse, nothing fancy. He tied up at the post himself, unhitched the horse himself, and walked toward the bunkhouse with a travel bag over one shoulder, looking like a man who'd been on the road a while and was tired and wanted to sit down. He was tall, that Clara registered from the kitchen window, not because she was particularly looking, but because the window faced the yard and she happened to be at the sink. Dark hair, not a young man's hair because it had some gray coming in at the sides. And he moved like someone who'd done physical work at some point, even if he'd stopped recently. His jacket was good, but it was dusty and he didn't seem to care about it. Pruitt met him in the yard. They shook hands. There wasn't the particular deference in Pruitt's posture that Clara expected, meaning either Pruitt didn't know who he was, which she doubted, or Ethan Caldwell didn't require it, which she filed away as interesting but probably irrelevant. She went back to the biscuits she was cutting. He appeared in her doorway about 20 minutes later. She nearly dropped the tin. Not because men never came to the kitchen. They did regularly, when they wanted something outside of meal hours or when they had a complaint, but because he'd knocked first. He was standing at the door frame that opened from the back of the bunkhouse into her kitchen, and he'd knocked on the wood of the door lightly and waited. Clara looked at him. He looked at her. There was about 2 seconds of total silence. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "I'm Ethan Caldwell. I just got in." He paused like he expected her to say something, then continued when she didn't. "I know I'm early for supper. I was wondering if there's any coffee going, but if there isn't, I'm not going to trouble you." Clara looked at the stove. There was coffee. There was always coffee. She kept it going from breakfast through most of the day because someone always wanted some at some unpredictable hour. "There's coffee," she said. "Could I get a cup if it's not—" "Yes," she said. "Sit down if you want." He sat down. He sat down at the rough bench on the far side of her work table, not in the kitchen doorway like a man waiting to be served, but actually in the room, and she poured him a cup and set it in front of him. He picked it up with both hands like someone who genuinely wanted to hold something warm after a long drive, and he said, "Thank you." And he meant it. She could hear the difference. She'd been listening to people say thank you in that kitchen for 2 years, and she knew the difference between the automatic thing a man says because his mother taught him to and the thing a person says when they're actually grateful. He drank the coffee. She cut the biscuits. Neither of them spoke for a minute. "Long drive?" she asked, finally, because the silence was getting to be a different kind of uncomfortable. "From Albuquerque," he said. "Took 2 days. Road's bad past the canyon." "It's always bad past the canyon." He nodded. He looked around the kitchen, not critically, not the way Briggs looked at it, but with something closer to curiosity. His eyes went to the drying herbs she had hanging from a ceiling nail, to the 2 jars of spice on the shelf that were hers and not the ranch's, to the notebook she kept near the stove with her notes on what she'd made and what needed adjusting. "You keep records," he said, nodding at the notebook. "Notes," she said. "Things I want to remember." "That's smart." He said it like he meant it, not like he was making conversation. "Most cooks I've known don't bother." She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she went back to the biscuits. He finished his coffee, thanked her again, and left. She stood there for a moment after he was gone, holding her biscuit cutter, aware of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't that he was handsome, though he was, in an unremarkable way that came more from how he held himself than from any particular feature. It wasn't that he'd been kind, exactly, though he had been. It was something more specific than that. He had looked at the notebook. He had noticed the notebook and asked about it, and then she'd said notes, things I want to remember, and he'd said that's smart, like it was the most ordinary response in the world. Like, of course, the cook would keep notes. Like, of course, she had a reason for the things she did. In 2 years at Red Canyon, no one had ever asked about the notebook. She put the biscuits in the oven and told herself that wasn't something to read anything into because it wasn't. One conversation with a wealthy man who said please and thank you didn't mean anything. The territory was full of men who had good manners in short encounters and forgot them in long ones. She knew that. She set the timer and knew that. Eve. Supper that night had 31 men at the table, which was more than usual because some of the hands from the East pasture had come in for provisions. Clara made a beef stew with the dried chilies and cornbread and a dried apple cake that she'd been saving the apples for because something, some instinct she couldn't explain, had told her to make the cake tonight. She was wrong, probably, but the cake turned out well, which was reason enough. She served through the window hatch that separated the kitchen from the dining side of the bunkhouse. Plates out, scraped plates back, coffee poured through the hatch without having to go in among the men if she could avoid it. She'd developed a system. You learned the angles and distances and how to move quickly along the work table so you were never waiting. She was in the middle of this when she heard Hank Briggs's voice, and she knew his voice the way you know any sound you've learned to brace against. He was saying something about the cornbread. His voice was carrying in the way voices carry when they're designed to carry. She didn't catch all the words. Something about it being dry, something about the last cook, something that made 2 or 3 men laugh. She kept moving, plates out, plates back, coffee. Then she heard a different voice, quieter, but with something in it that made the other voices drop. I think the cornbread is excellent. She stopped. Through the hatch, she had a partial view of the long table, the near end, about 6 seats. Ethan Caldwell was 3 seats from the near end. He was looking at Hank Briggs, and Hank Briggs was looking back at him, and there was a pause that had a shape to it, a particular shape that happens when 2 men are measuring each other, and one of them doesn't know yet that the measurement isn't going to go the way he assumed. "You just got here," Briggs said. Not quite a challenge yet, but moving toward one. "That's true," Ethan said. He didn't say it defensively. He picked up his coffee cup. "Still think the cornbread is excellent." Another pause. Briggs looked away first. He made some comment to the man next to him that Clara didn't catch. And the moment passed, and the table went back to the ordinary noise of 31 men eating. Clara stood at the hatch with a plate in her hand. She set it down carefully and went back to the stove. And she was aware that her hands were not quite steady, and she told herself that was nothing. That was just the adrenaline of an unexpected moment. That was just because she hadn't eaten enough today and was tired. She told herself that, and then she cut the apple cake and made herself take a piece before she sent the rest out, because she was tired and she hadn't eaten enough, and she would not stand there in her own kitchen letting her hand shake over something a man said at a table she hadn't even been sitting at. The cake was good. She ate it standing up and let it be good. Through the hatch, she could hear the general noise of supper winding down, the scrape of benches, the last conversation, the men starting to move. She heard Briggs's voice once more, closer to the hatch, but whatever he was saying was aimed at someone else, and she didn't try to catch it. She was scrubbing the stew pot when she heard the knock again. Same knock as before. 3 light taps on the door frame. She turned. Ethan Caldwell was standing at the kitchen door, holding his empty plate. "I can take that," she said. "I know. I wanted to say the cake was something else." He set the plate down on the side table near the door. "I didn't ask your name this afternoon." She looked at him. "Clara," she said. "Clara." He nodded like he was putting it somewhere specific. "That was a real meal, Clara. I mean that." She should have said thank you and gone back to the pot. She knew that. That was the correct thing, the sensible thing. Acknowledge and move on. Keep the distance between herself and the men who came through this kitchen, because distance was a form of protection she'd built deliberately. What she said instead was, "The apples were starting to go. I've been waiting for the right time to use them." He looked at her for a moment like she'd said something interesting. "You waited on purpose. Dried apples taste better later in the season," she said. "When the men are tired and the weather's turning, they need it more." He was quiet for just a second. Then he said, "That's a good way to think about it." "It's just practical," she said. "Maybe," he said. He picked up his coffee cup from where he'd left it near the door. Good night, Clara. Good night, Mr. Caldwell. He left. She went back to the stew pot. Through the small window, she could hear the last of the men crossing the yard toward the bunkhouse, their voices getting quieter as the distance grew. The night out there was cold and clear and still in the way New Mexico nights got still. Absolutely, completely, like the dark itself had gone solid. She finished the pot and started on the cornbread pan and thought about apples. She thought about the fact that no one had ever asked her why she waited on them. Not once in 2 years. The next morning, she was up at 3:45, which was 5 minutes earlier than usual, because she'd woken from a dream she couldn't remember and couldn't get back to sleep, and there was no point lying on the cot when the stove needed stoking anyway. She was halfway through the breakfast prep when she heard the back door of the bunkhouse open. Not the kitchen door, the other one, the one that led into the yard. She heard footsteps on the dirt, heading away. She looked through the small window and saw Ethan Caldwell walking toward the stable in the dark, his jacket on, boots on, moving like a man who'd been up for a while. She watched until he was out of sight, which she recognized immediately as something she shouldn't be doing, and turned back to the eggs. He came back an hour later when the sky was starting to go gray at the edges. She heard the door again, and then nothing for a while, and then the knock on the kitchen door frame. She turned around. He was standing there in better light than before, and she could see that his jacket had hay on it, and his hair was not quite in order, and his eyes were the particular kind of tired that comes from being awake at 3 in the morning. Not because you had to be, but because something in your head wouldn't let you rest. "Is there coffee?" he asked. "It's been going since 4, she said. He sat back down on the bench. She poured him a cup and set it in front of him, same as the afternoon before, and went back to the eggs. "I was checking the horses," he said after a moment. "Old habit. When I can't sleep, I find something to do." "You couldn't sleep," she said. She hadn't meant to ask it. It came out before she'd decided to say it. "Not particularly." He looked at the cup. "This ranch is different from what I expected." She cracked an egg into the bowl. "Different how?" "Quieter." He paused. "Or maybe not quieter. Harder. There's a particular kind of hardness in a place when people stop." He stopped himself. "Sorry, that doesn't make much sense at this hour." "It makes sense," Clara said. She cracked another egg. "When people stop what?" He looked at her. "Stop expecting anything good," he said. "It changes the air. You can feel it." She didn't say anything to that for a moment. She was working the eggs and thinking about what he'd just said, which was something she'd never heard anyone articulate and had been feeling for 2 years without having the words for it. "You're right," she said. "It does change the air." He looked at her like she'd confirmed something he'd been uncertain about. He picked up the coffee. "I heard what Briggs said at supper," he said. She kept her eyes on the eggs. "I heard what you said." "I meant it," he said. "The cornbread was excellent." "I know," she said, and was mildly startled to hear herself say it that directly. Not arrogantly, just as a statement of fact, the way she'd say the eggs are ready or the weather's coming in from the north. She knew when her food was good. She'd stopped apologizing for knowing that. He laughed. It was a short, genuine sound, a little surprised. "Good," he said. "You should know." She kept cooking. He kept drinking the coffee. The sky outside the small window was going from gray to pale orange, which meant it was almost time to start the biscuits, and in about 30 minutes the first of the hands would start stumbling in. "What's in the notebook?" he asked. She looked up. "The notebook?" "The one by the stove. You were writing in it when I came in." She hadn't realized he'd noticed that. She set the bowl down. "Recipes," she said. "And not recipes. Things I'm working out." She hesitated. "Someday I want to open a restaurant." She hadn't said that out loud. Not here. Not in this kitchen. Not to anyone on this ranch. The silence that followed was the kind she couldn't read, and she braced herself for whatever was on the other side of it. The gentle dismissal. The polite skepticism. That's nice that men said to women who stated ambitions they'd already decided were too large. What Ethan Caldwell said was, "What kind?" She looked at him. "What kind of restaurant?" he said. She put down the egg bowl and told him. She hadn't planned to, But he'd asked like he wanted to know, and there it was, and a real question, directed at her, in her kitchen, before sunrise, with nobody else in the room. And something in her that had been held very still for a very long time moved without her permission. She told him about the kind of food she wanted to serve. Not fancy. She wasn't interested in fancy for its own sake. Good. Honest food made properly, with care, the kind that a working person could afford but that tasted like someone had thought about them when they made it. A place where it didn't matter what you looked like or where you'd come from, because the food was the only credential that counted. She talked for 4 minutes. She knew it was 4 minutes because she tracked time by instinct in that kitchen, and in 4 minutes she needed to start the biscuits. When she finished, she started the biscuits. Ethan Caldwell sat at the bench and didn't say anything for a long moment. "The air in this kitchen is different from the rest of the ranch," he said finally. She glanced at him. "People here still expect something good," he said. She didn't answer that. She was working the dough. But she felt it. That particular thing that happens in your chest when someone sees something clearly about you, clearly enough to name it, and they name it correctly. She worked the dough and didn't say anything and let herself feel it, just for the length of the biscuit cutting, just that long. Then the first of the hands came in, and the morning became the morning, and she was the cook behind the kitchen door again. But Ethan Caldwell sat at that bench with his coffee until breakfast was ready, and when he took his plate, he said, "Thank you, Clara." And he said it like it was her name, not just a word. She thought about the restaurant. She thought about it differently than she had before. The bench where Ethan Caldwell had sat that morning was empty by the time Clara finished washing the breakfast dishes. But the coffee cup he'd left behind was still there on the edge of the work table, and she picked it up and held it for just a second longer than she needed to before she put it with the others. She noticed herself doing it. She set the cup down with the rest and went back to taking inventory. That was the thing about mornings at Red Canyon. They ended the same way, regardless of what happened in them. The men went out, the kitchen emptied, and Clara was left with the wreckage of feeding 30-some people in a room that still smelled like coffee and salt pork, and she put it all back in order the same as she always did. And the morning she'd just had folded itself into the morning before it, and the one before that, until they were all roughly the same morning. She told herself that was what this was. She told herself that, and made herself believe it for most of the day. It lasted until about 3 in the afternoon, when she was kneading bread dough for supper, and Gil came in with the supply list she'd asked him to check, and he set it on the corner of the work table and said, without any particular emphasis, "Mr. Caldwell, fix the hinge on the back door." Clara kept kneading. "What hinge?" "The one on the kitchen door, the one that's been sticking since August." Gil was looking at the list, not at her. "I saw him out there this morning with a screwdriver. Door open straight now." She had not noticed this. She tried the door after Gil left, and he was right. It swung clean and quiet without the grinding catch it had made for the past 2 months. She stood there holding the door open for a moment, not quite sure what to do with this information. She let it close and went back to the bread. Nobody had fixed that hinge. She'd mentioned it to Pruitt twice. He'd nodded both times the way he nodded at things he had no intention of doing anything about. And she'd stopped mentioning it because there were limits to how many times a person could ask before asking became a different, more humiliating thing. Ethan Caldwell had been at this ranch for less than 24 hours. She kneaded the bread and thought about that and told herself it didn't mean anything particular, that he was probably just a man who saw broken things and fixed them, that it had nothing to do with her kitchen or with her specifically, and she believed about half of it. He came back at 4:30 with 2 of the other hands, Reardon and a newer man named Taft, and the 3 of them were talking about the east fence line as they came in. A technical conversation about post spacing that Clara wasn't paying attention to until she realized they'd stopped in the doorway and Ethan was saying something to the other 2 men that made them head off toward the yard and he was coming alone to the kitchen door. He knocked. She'd started to expect it, which bothered her slightly. "I've got about 40 minutes before the evening check," he said. "Is there anything you need moved or fixed while I have the time?" Clara looked at him. She was holding a wooden spoon. "You fixed the door hinge." "It was sticking," he said, like this was sufficient explanation. "I know it was sticking. I've been here 2 years. He looked at her steadily. He wasn't embarrassed, which was interesting. "I noticed it when I came in last night," he said. It didn't seem like it should be that hard to fix. It wasn't, she said. Pruitt just didn't bother. Something moved through his expression at that, not quite anger, but adjacent to it, a controlled recognition of something he didn't like. Well, he said, it's fixed now. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, the shelf on the south wall is pulling from the bracket. Left side. It's going to come down eventually. I'll need a hammer and a longer nail. There's a toolbox under the bench in the storeroom, she said. I don't know what's in it. I'll check, he said, and went to find it. He was back in 10 minutes. He fixed the shelf in another 15, which involved some noise, and one moment when the bracket came completely loose, and the shelf dipped at an alarming angle, and Clara moved 3 canning jars out of the way without being asked. And he said, thank you, and she said, hold on, I've got it. And they righted it together, and he got the longer nail seated and hammered it flush, and the shelf sat straight and solid. He stepped back and looked at it. That'll hold now. Better than it did before, she said. He put the hammer back in the box. Then he looked around the kitchen, that same noticing look she'd seen from him before, not critical, just observant, and said, what else? What else what? What else in here needs attention? Clara set down the spoon. She looked at him steadily. You don't have to do this. I know I don't have to, he said. He met her eyes without any particular performance of sincerity, just a directness she was starting to recognize as simply the way he spoke. I don't do things I have to. What else needs attention? She told him about the draft in the corner near the stovepipe, which had been letting cold air in since October, and which she'd been addressing with a folded flour sack pressed into the gap. He found the gap, packed it properly with a piece of scrap wood he pulled from the junk behind the storeroom, and sealed the edge with a strip of canvas he cut from an old saddlebag he found in the same pile. It took him an hour and 10 minutes. He was late for the evening check, and she heard Reardon calling for him from the yard, and he said, 1 minute, and finished what he was doing before he went. Clara stood at the stove and felt the difference in the air near the corner where the draft had been, and the absence of it was so immediate and specific that she felt, for one unguarded moment, something very close to grief. Not about the draft, but about the fact that a simple thing like this, a draft fixed and a shelf secured and a door that swung clean, had taken 2 years to happen, and had happened because a man she'd met 30 hours ago noticed. She put the grief somewhere she couldn't reach it easily and started the supper. Eek. Hank Briggs noticed. She knew he noticed because she could track his moods through the sounds he made in the dining room and the way his voice shifted in register when something was bothering him. He was loud when he was happy, louder when he was annoyed, and very quiet in a particular way when he felt that something was happening around him that he didn't control. He'd been that kind of quiet all day, and at supper he found his opening. Clara was passing plates through the hatch when she heard him, loud again now, talking about the new man. Not to Ethan, because Ethan was at the far end of the table, to the group of men around him, which was Briggs's preferred stage. Seems like some men got a lot of time to spend around the kitchen, Briggs said, in the particular voice he used when he wanted a thing to be heard everywhere without appearing to direct it at anyone. Must be nice, not having real work to do. There was the small silence that followed that kind of comment. A couple of men shifted. Nobody answered him directly. Then Ethan's voice from the far end, level and unhurried. I fixed the door hinge, the shelf bracket, and a draft by the stovepipe. Took me about 2 hours. Didn't touch my fence work. Briggs's mouth opened and closed briefly. There's usually more work than people to do it, Ethan continued, picking up his coffee, on a ranch where the equipment doesn't get maintained. He didn't look at Briggs when he said it. He looked at the coffee cup. Somebody should have fixed that shelf months ago. The table was quiet in a different way than it had been. Old Peterson, at the near end, put his fork down and picked it up again in a way that meant he was hiding a smile. Briggs didn't respond. He ate the rest of his meal without another word aimed at the kitchen, and Clara stood at the hatch with a plate in each hand and let herself feel the particular quality of that silence for exactly 3 seconds before she went back to work. 3 seconds was enough. 3 days passed in the new rhythm of it, and Clara kept waiting for it to become ordinary, for Ethan Caldwell to settle into the ranch's existing pattern the way every other man eventually did. It was what happened. People arrived with their particularity intact, and then the days ground it down and they became part of the machinery of the place, predictable, consistent, no longer surprising. He didn't do that. He came to the kitchen door every morning at some point before the rest of the men were up, and he knocked, and he drank his coffee at the bench, and he talked to her. Not about himself, mostly, or not only about himself. He asked questions, not personal questions, not the kind that felt like they were trying to locate a weakness, but real questions about the food, about the ranch, about how things worked. He asked why she bought dried chilies instead of canned. She told him. Dried held their flavor longer, were cheaper by weight, rehydrated better than people expected. He listened. He didn't nod the way men nodded when they were waiting for a woman to finish talking. He listened like the information mattered. He asked about the notebook again. She started telling him about a dish she'd been working out, a slow-braised short rib with a specific combination of spice that she'd been adjusting for weeks, not quite there yet, something still off in the timing. He said, "What do you think it is?" "The timing." "I think the chili goes in too early," she said. "I think it needs to wait until the meat has colored. Have you tried it that way?" "I can't," she said. "Not here. I don't have short ribs on the ranch's budget." He looked at the notebook. He didn't say anything immediately, and she could see him thinking, turning something over. "If I get the ribs," he said, "would you be willing to test it?" She looked at him. "You'd buy ribs." "I'd like to taste what you're working out," he said, "and you'd have your answer." She watched him for a long moment, reading him the way she'd learned to read men who came into her kitchen, looking for the angle. And she couldn't find one. There was no angle. He was just exactly what he appeared to be, which was something she had very limited experience with. "All right," she said. He brought the ribs back on a Thursday, wrapped in butcher paper from a town 12 miles off. He set them on her work table without ceremony and went to do his fence work, and she braised them that afternoon, chili going in at the precise point she'd been theorizing about for 3 weeks, and the result came out exactly the way she'd been imagining it. The heat layered into the meat without overwhelming the base, the fat rendered properly, the sauce reduced to the right weight. She put a portion in a bowl and left it at the end of the work table. When he came in that evening, he sat down, ate it, and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. "That's it," he said. "I know," she said. She was writing in the notebook, the timing, the exact sequence. "You need to make that for people," he said, "not just ranch hands." She kept writing. "That's the plan." She heard him sit back slightly. "What are you waiting for?" The question landed with more precision than she'd expected. She kept her eyes on the notebook. "Money," she said, which was true and was also only part of the truth, and she thought he probably knew that from the way he didn't say anything immediately after she said it. "What else?" he said. She looked up. He was watching hers with that same steady directness, not pushing, just waiting. She put the pen down. "The world doesn't exactly hand restaurants to women who cook for ranch hands," she said. "No," he said, "it doesn't." He picked up the bowl again and ate another bite. "That's not an answer to what you're waiting for, though. That's the obstacle. What are you waiting for?" She didn't answer that night. She went back to the stove and he finished the ribs and left, and she thought about the question for 3 hours after the kitchen was dark and everyone else was long asleep. She thought about it because she didn't have a clean answer to it, and she was accustomed to having clean answers about herself. She'd built herself on clean answers. Practical, direct, no room for wishes that didn't have plans behind them. But what Ethan Caldwell had asked her, the way he'd separated obstacle from what are you waiting for, was a distinction she hadn't made herself, and she wasn't sure she liked that he'd made it, because it meant looking at something she'd been keeping at arm's length. She was waiting for permission. Not from him, not from Pruitt, or any man on this ranch. From herself. From the part of herself that had learned across enough hard years that wanting things loudly was how you got hurt. She didn't write that in the notebook. By the end of his first week, the dynamic in the bunkhouse had shifted in ways that Clara observed through her window and through the conversations that floated through the kitchen door. Ethan had positioned himself in the ranch's hierarchy not by asserting it. She never heard him pull rank, never heard him invoke his family name or his money in any argument, but by the simple, relentless quality of his competence. He worked. He worked well and without complaint, and he knew more than he let on, which was the specific combination that earned respect from men who didn't give it easily. Briggs felt it. He felt it the way all men of Briggs's type felt the presence of someone they couldn't dismiss, with an intensifying irritability, a need to locate the weak point, the thing that would knock the new man down to a manageable size. He found it, or thought he found it, on Saturday morning. Clara heard it from the kitchen. She heard most things from the kitchen, which was its own form of education. Briggs had apparently told several of the hands that he'd seen Ethan spending time in the kitchen helping out, and he'd characterized it in terms Clara didn't repeat to herself. And he'd done it loudly enough that it was meant to travel, and it traveled. By noon, there were jokes. Not vicious ones, yea, some of the men at Red Canyon were fundamentally decent, just going along with something because Briggs had set the tone, but jokes, the kind with an edge. She heard the tail end of one through the hatch and kept her face neutral and her hands moving and her eyes down. She didn't see Ethan for most of the day. He was out with the fence crew. He came back at 5, and she heard raised voices in the yard before she heard his footsteps. And then the voices dropped, and there was a brief silence, and then the sound of Briggs saying something short and flat, and boots crossing the yard in different directions. She didn't ask about it. He came to the kitchen door at 5:15. He looked like a man who'd resolved something he didn't fully want to have to resolve, tired in a way that wasn't about physical work, with a tightness around his jaw that was fading as she watched. "Smells good," he said. "It's the short rib variation," she said. "I had the leftover spice mix and the butcher sent extra." He sat down. He didn't mention the yard. She poured him coffee and didn't ask. After a minute, he said, "Briggs has been making things difficult for you." It wasn't a question. She set the coffee pot down. "He's been doing that since October," she said. "Before you got here." "I know." He was looking at the table. "I should have said something sooner than supper last week." She looked at him. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "You're not responsible for what Briggs does." "No," he said, "but I'm not going to pretend I don't see it." She stood very still for a second. Then she went back to the stove. "He knocked a platter of food on the floor," she said, "the morning before you arrived, just to make a point." The silence behind her had a specific quality. "I'm going to speak with Pruitt," he said. "Pruitt won't do anything," she said. "I've tried." "Pruitt will do something if I ask it," he said, not with arrogance, just with the flat certainty of a man who understood exactly where he stood in a particular arrangement. "And I don't like using that, but I'll use it for this." She turned around and looked at him. He met her eyes. "You shouldn't have to work like this," he said. "Nobody should. What Briggs does is—" He stopped. He seemed to be choosing between several things he could say. "It's wrong," he said. "Simple as that." She stood there and felt something work its way loose that had been sitting in her chest for a long time. Not grief this time. Not the bitter, close-held thing she'd been carrying since before Red Canyon. Something more like the specific exhaustion that comes with finally being seen in a situation you've been managing alone. She didn't cry. That wasn't something she did in her kitchen, but she felt the pressure of it behind her eyes, and she turned back to the stove and kept her voice even when she said, "All right." "All right?" he said. "Talk to Pruitt," she said. "But don't do it in front of anyone. He'll dig in if he's embarrassed." A pause. "That's useful," he said. "I've been here 2 years," she said. "I know how he responds." "Right." She could hear something in his voice that might have been the beginning of a smile. "What else should I know?" She kept cooking. She told him 3 things about Pruitt: that he responded to problems framed as ranch efficiency issues rather than personal ones, that he hated being the last to know about something, and that he was more likely to act on a complaint from a man than from her, which was unjust and also just the working truth of the situation. Ethan listened to all of it without interrupting. At the end he said, "You've done a lot of managing alone out here." "Yes," she said. "That's going to change," he said. She didn't answer that. She plated the short rib variation and set it in front of him and went to start the cornbread for the main supper, and he ate it and was quiet. And the kitchen held the particular warmth it always held at this hour, the stove heat and the smell of the spice and the last light going orange through the small window. She thought about what he'd said. That's going to change. She thought about it carefully, not romantically, not with any of the easy hope that a different kind of woman might have reached for. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, practically looking for what it actually meant, what the evidence behind it was. The evidence was a fixed door hinge, a secured shelf, a sealed draft, short ribs for a recipe test, a confrontation with Briggs at the supper table on the first night, and now this, a man sitting in her kitchen saying it's wrong, simple as that, and meaning it. She put the cornbread in the oven. She thought that maybe she'd been wrong about something she'd believed for a long time. Not about men in general. She wasn't ready to revise that broadly, and she wasn't sure she should. But maybe she'd been wrong about the specific possibility of one particular person. She didn't let herself go further than that. She checked the cornbread and wrote the short rib timing in the notebook and started the coffee for supper. And Ethan Caldwell sat at the bench and watched the last of the daylight leave the small window, and neither of them said anything, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was, she realized, the most comfortable silence she'd had in 2 years on this ranch, which was something she chose not to examine too closely for the rest of the evening. Pruitt spoke to Briggs on Sunday. Clara didn't know what was said. She didn't hear it, and nobody volunteered the information. But she noticed that Briggs was quiet at breakfast and quieter at supper, a kind of stillness that was different from his usual silence, a silence with something under it that he was working to keep contained. He didn't knock anything over. He didn't make comments through the hatch. He sat at the table and ate and left. On Monday, Taft, the newer hand, stopped at the kitchen door and asked for a second biscuit, which was ordinary enough, but he said please first, which wasn't. Clara gave him 2. On Tuesday, Porter, the young man who had laughed the morning of the platter incident, came by in the mid-afternoon with a crate of apples from the supply wagon that had apparently arrived early, and he set it just inside the kitchen door and said, "Thought you'd want these right away," and left before she could respond. She didn't know if Ethan had said something to the men, or if the shift was just the natural result of Briggs's influence having been quietly trimmed, but something had moved in the atmosphere of the ranch, and she felt it the way she'd felt the draft when it was gone, in the absence, in the clean, simple fact of what was no longer there. On Wednesday, Ethan came in at his usual time and sat at his usual place and picked up his coffee and said without preamble, "There's a gathering at the Caldwell Ranch in 3 weeks. My family hosts it. Big affair. Owners from 4 territories, business people, ranching families." Clara turned from the stove. "All right," she said, waiting. "I'd like you to cook for it," he said. She stood very still. "Not in a kitchen nobody sees," he said, like he'd anticipated the particular nature of her hesitation. "Front of house, talking to guests, your food, your name on it." She looked at him for a long moment. She heard the early morning sounds of the ranch starting up outside, the horses in the stable, somewhere a door, Gil crossing the yard with the water bucket. Ordinary sounds. The ordinary morning she'd woken up to for 2 years. "I'm a ranch cook," she said, and heard immediately how flat that sounded, how much it resembled the thing she'd been arguing against internally for longer than she could clearly remember. "You're a woman who has been cooking for ranch hands because that was the available option," Ethan said, with a straightforwardness that was neither cruel nor gentle, just accurate. "That's not the same thing." She turned back to the stove. Her hands moved to the eggs, which were ready, which needed attention. She cracked them and let herself think, not perform thinking, actually think, standing at the stove with the morning light coming up through the small window and 30-some men about to come in for breakfast, and her whole plain life exactly as it was and had been. She thought about the restaurant in the notebook. She thought about the short rib timing, the chili going in late, the way it had come out right when she'd finally trusted the instinct she'd been second-guessing for months. She thought about what she'd been waiting for. Who would be there? She said. "People who make decisions," he said. "Ranching families, yes, but business people too. People who run hotels, supply companies. People who have money to invest in something good." He paused. "People who could make things possible that aren't currently possible." She kept cooking. "Tell me about the menu," she said. He didn't hide the thing that moved across his face then, the relief of it. Or maybe it was just the particular warmth that happens when something you were hoping for turns out to be real. He picked up his coffee. "That's your domain," he said. "I'll tell you what I can get you. You tell me what you need." She turned around and looked at him fully. This man at her work table who had been at this ranch for less than 2 weeks and had fixed her door and her shelf and her draft and a problem she'd been managing alone for months, and was now sitting in her kitchen at 5 in the morning, offering her something she'd been imagining in secret for 2 years. She looked at him and tried to find the angle one more time, the catch, the thing underneath it all that would eventually reveal itself and turn this into another disappointment she'd have to file away and survive. She couldn't find it. "All right," she said, "let me think about the menu." He nodded. He drank the coffee. She plated the eggs and started the biscuits, and outside the window the sky was going from orange to the particular pale blue of a New Mexico morning in November, cold and clear and very wide. And Clara felt something she hadn't felt in long enough that she'd stopped cataloging its absence. She felt like something was about to happen, not in the easy, fragile way of wishful thinking, in the way of a woman who had been getting ready for something for 2 years without knowing what she was getting ready for and was beginning to understand. She spent 3 days on the menu before she showed it to anyone, not because she was uncertain. The framework had come to her quickly, the night after Ethan had asked, while she was lying on the cot behind the curtain listening to the wind work at the corner of the bunkhouse. She knew what she wanted to cook. She'd known it the way she always knew, with that quiet certainty that didn't ask permission. The uncertainty was about something else entirely, whether to show it to him at all, whether showing it was the same as committing to something she hadn't fully decided to commit to yet. She showed it to him on a Thursday morning, sliding the notebook across the work table while his coffee was still steaming. He picked it up and read it. He read it properly, not scanning, reading line by line, the way a person reads when the content is actually landing. He turned the page. He went back to something on the first page and read it again. She kept her hands busy at the stove and did not watch him too obviously. "The short rib," he said finally. "It's what I know works," she said. "I won't put something on a menu I haven't tested." "And the rest?" "The corn pudding I've made 100 times. The biscuits you've already eaten." She paused. "The pickled green beans are new. I worked them out last winter, but I've been making them every week since. They're ready." He set the notebook down. He looked at it for another moment, then at her. "This is a real menu," he said. "What did you think it would be?" He almost smiled. "I didn't know," he said. "I was hoping." She took the notebook back. "I need to know the guest count and what ingredients I can source from where. And I need to know about the kitchen I'll be working in." "My family's ranch has a full kitchen," he said, "properly equipped. 3 stoves, 2 ovens, more counter space than you have here." "That's not what I asked," she said. "I asked what the kitchen is like, size of the ovens, whether the stoves burn even, where the light comes in." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'll take you there before the event. You can see it yourself." She hadn't expected that. "You'd do that?" "It's a reasonable request," he said. "You need to know the space. Of course you should see it." She turned back to the stove and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Guest count. Between 60 and 80. It changes every year. My mother sends final numbers a week out." "Your mother organizes it?" "My mother runs it," he said, with a precision that told her something about Margaret Caldwell without him intending to. "Has since my father died. That's been 9 years now." Clara stirred the porridge and filed this away. A woman who had been running a major territorial gathering for 9 years, who held the actual authority in that household, whatever the outward appearance might be. This was important information. "Does she know about this?" Clara said. "That you've asked me?" The pause that followed was brief but definite. "Not yet," he said. She turned around. He met her eyes without flinching. "That's a problem," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll write to her today." "You should have written to her before you asked me." "Yes," he said. "I should have." He didn't excuse it. He picked up his coffee and drank it and looked out the small window. "I'll write today. I'll tell you what she says." She watched him for a moment. He was being honest with her, which she appreciated, and he was also showing her the particular flaw she'd been looking for. Not a cruel one, not a hidden one, just the natural blind spot of a man who was accustomed to his own decisions being sufficient. He'd asked her before securing his mother's agreement because it hadn't occurred to him that his mother's agreement was a variable. It had occurred to Clara immediately. She'd just been waiting to see if it would occur to him. "All right," she said. Write to her today. The letter took 4 days to get a response, which was faster than Claire expected given the distance. She knew a response had arrived because Ethan came to the kitchen door that evening with a particular look. Not bad exactly, but not the easy openness he usually carried. He sat down. She poured the coffee. She has questions, he said. I'd expect that, Clara said. She wants to know your background, where you trained, who you've cooked for, what your experience is outside ranch work. He put the letter on the table but didn't push it toward her, like he was deciding whether to show her the exact words. She's not dismissing it. She's being thorough. That's fair, Clara said. She sat down on the stool across the work table, something she did rarely, because the kitchen was a working space and sitting down in it felt like stopping when she should be moving. But this required the kind of attention that wasn't compatible with standing at the stove. What else? She wants to know why I'm suggesting a ranch cook for an event of this size. He said it plainly, without softening it, which she appreciated. What did you tell her? I told her I've eaten your food for 2 weeks, and it's the best cooking I've encountered since I left for ranching, and I've eaten at establishments in Albuquerque and Santa Fe that charge considerably more for considerably less. He looked at her. I also told her that you have a menu already developed and a specific approach to the event, and that if she'd entertain a conversation with you directly, she could judge for herself. Clara was quiet for a moment. You told her she could talk to me directly. Yes. Does she want to? She said if you can come to the ranch in the next week and speak with her personally, she'll make a decision after that conversation. He looked at the letter again. She said, and I'm reading this to you directly, I will not commit to an unknown quantity on your word alone, but I am willing to form my own opinion. Clara thought about this. She thought about a woman who had been running a major household and territorial event for 9 years, who chose the phrase unknown quantity and meant it precisely, who was willing to form her own opinion. She thought about what kind of woman that was and what kind of conversation it would require. When can we go? She said. Something moved across Ethan's face. Day after tomorrow, he said, if that works. I'll need to arrange for Gil to cover breakfast, she said. I'll talk to Pruitt. Let me talk to Pruitt, she said. I know how to frame it. He looked at her, almost smiled. Right, he said. You know how he responds. I do, she said, and picked up his coffee cup and set it aside and stood. Day after tomorrow, early start. They left Red Canyon at 5 in the morning before anyone was properly up, and Ethan's wagon with the brown horse that she'd watched him unhitch the day he arrived. The drive was 4 hours across country that was flat and then not flat and then flat again. The red earth giving way gradually to a paler soil, the scrub thickening toward something that might generously be called a tree line. Clara sat on the wagon bench and did not say much for the first hour, which was fine because Ethan did not seem to require conversation. He was easy to be quiet with, which was not a quality she'd identified in many people, and she let herself notice it without making too much of it. She watched the country and thought about Margaret Caldwell. At the 2-hour mark, he said, without any particular lead-in, My mother is not a difficult person. She's a precise one. There's a difference. Clara looked at him. I know the difference. She'll ask you direct questions, he said. She responds well to direct answers, not performed confidence. She can tell the difference. Just directness. I'm aware of how to speak with a woman who runs things, Clara said, and there was more edge in her voice than she intended, not because she was angry at him, but because there was a particular frustration in being given advice about how to speak to another woman, even well-intentioned advice. He heard the edge. He was quiet for a moment. You're right, he said. I shouldn't have said that. She looked at him. He was watching the road. He wasn't retreating into silence the way men did when they'd been corrected and felt embarrassed. He'd just said, You're right, and meant it, and kept driving. I appreciate the information about her, Clara said after a moment. The manner advice I don't need. Understood, he said. They drove another mile in silence. Tell me about her, Clara said. Not advice. Information. What is she like? He thought for a moment. He told her. Margaret Caldwell was 61 years old and had come from a New Mexico ranching family herself, not wealthy, respectable. She had married into the Caldwell fortune at 22 and learned the business not because anyone taught her, but because she paid attention and no one told her not to. When Ethan's father died, the assumption among the territorial business community had been that the Caldwell holdings would need to be sold or managed by outside interests, because a woman alone with a grown son who preferred working cattle to sitting in meetings was not a serious proposition. Margaret Caldwell had proceeded to increase the ranch's annual output by 30% in 5 years and build the territorial gathering from a modest social occasion into the most significant business meeting in the region. Clara listened to all of this and said, when he finished, "How does she take it? When people underestimate her?" Ethan glanced over at her. "Badly," he said. Quietly. "She has a long memory." "Good," Clara said. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked back at the road. "You two are going to either get along very well or not at all," he said. "Which do you think?" Clara said. "I think you're going to get along," he said. "But it's going to take longer than you'd like." She thought he was probably right about that. The Caldwell Ranch was larger than Clara had prepared herself for, which she immediately recognized as her own failure of imagination. She'd pictured a bigger version of Red Canyon, more buildings, more hands, better maintained. What she found was something that operated on an entirely different scale, with a main house that was 2 full stories of adobe and timber and a working yard that had its own organized logic to it, different areas for different functions, a bunkhouse that could sleep 40, a stable that could hold 60 horses. She didn't let herself visibly react to any of it. Margaret Caldwell met them in front of the main house. She was a tall woman, taller than Clara had pictured, with gray hair pinned practically and a face that had been handsome and was now something better than handsome. Specific, defined, the kind of face that has been shaped by a long time of making decisions. She wore a plain dark dress and no jewelry except a watch pinned to her bodice. She looked at Ethan first. Something passed between them, quick, a mother-son recognition that wasn't warm exactly but was deep. Then she looked at Clara. "Miss Whitmore," she said. "Mrs. Caldwell," Clara said. "Come inside," Margaret said. "We'll talk in the kitchen." The kitchen was exactly what Ethan had described in terms of equipment, and nothing like what she'd expected in terms of feel. It was a working kitchen, not a showpiece, not a space designed to impress visitors. The surfaces had been used hard and cleaned well. The equipment was professional and showed wear in the right places. The light came in from 2 windows on the east side, which meant good morning light, and the stoves were positioned intelligently relative to the workspace. Clara looked at it all and felt the particular thing she felt in any new kitchen, a kind of reading, a quick assessment, noting what it could do. Margaret watched her look. "What do you see?" Margaret said. Clara turned. Margaret was leaning against the doorframe, watching her with an expression that gave nothing away. "Good stoves," Clara said. "The east light is useful. Counter space is sufficient. I'd want to know if the right oven runs hot. There's a worn spot on the door that suggests it gets more use than the left, which sometimes means a draft issue." Margaret looked at the oven. She looked at the worn spot on the door. She looked at Clara. "It runs 10 degrees hot," she said. "We adjust by time." "I adjust by feel," Clara said, "but I'd need an hour with it before the event day to calibrate." A silence. "Sit down," Margaret said. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Ethan had apparently understood that this was not his conversation, because he'd poured himself water and taken himself to the far end of the kitchen, where he was being notably quiet. Margaret asked her questions. They were direct and specific. Where had she learned to cook? Who had she cooked for? What was the largest event she had catered? What did she consider her weaknesses? Clara answered all of them the same way, directly, without embellishment, without apology. She named her weaknesses honestly. She had not cooked for more than 40 at a single service. The event would require scaling she hadn't fully tested, and she had limited experience with the specific social expectations of a formal territorial gathering. She watched Margaret register each answer. Then Margaret said, "My son tells me you have a menu." Clara put the notebook on the table. Margaret opened it. She read it the way Ethan had read it, properly, not scanning. She turned the page. She went back to the beginning. She looked at the notes Clara had made in the margins, the timing adjustments, the sourcing questions. "These margin notes," Margaret said. "These are working notes." "Yes," Clara said. "You wrote them while you were developing these dishes." "While I was adjusting them," Clara said. "Most of these I've made in some version for years. The margin notes are where they changed." Margaret looked at the short rib entry. At the note Clara had made, "Chili late, after color, timing 40 minutes, circled and underlined. "You figured something out here," she said. "The timing on the chili," Clara said. "I'd been putting it in too early. The flavor was right, but the heat was wrong. It sat on top instead of into the meat." "And now? Now it's right," Clara said. Margaret looked up at her. "How do you know when something is right?" Clara didn't have to think about the answer. "You know," she said, "the same way you know when something's wrong. You've made it enough times that you've learned what it wants to be. You stop arguing with it." The silence that followed was longer than the others. Then Margaret Caldwell closed the notebook and pushed it back across the table and said, "I want you to cook me something, right now, from what I have in this kitchen, something off this menu." Clara looked at her. "I need to taste what you can do before I commit," Margaret said. "Not the concept, the food." "That's fair," Clara said. She picked up the notebook. "What do you have?" She made the corn pudding because it was what the kitchen had available in full, and she made the pickled green beans on the side, and biscuits because she had learned that biscuits told you something essential about a cook if you knew what to look for. Margaret sat at the kitchen table and did not help and did not watch too obviously, which was the correct thing to do. Ethan stayed at the far end and also did not watch too obviously, which Clara noticed and appreciated. She worked. She worked the way she always worked, not performing, not rushing, not slowing down for effect. The pudding required 30 minutes in the oven, and she spent the waiting time on the biscuits, which she cut by hand and put in the hotter oven, timing them against the pudding with the instinct she'd built over years of managing two things at once. She set the plates herself. Not elaborately. This was not an elaborate meal. It was a demonstration. She brought them to the table and sat back down across from Margaret and waited. Margaret ate the corn pudding first. She ate slowly and without expression. She tried the pickled beans, which were cold, and held that flavor for a moment before swallowing. She broke a biscuit open. She looked at the inside of the biscuit. Claire had learned long ago that you could tell almost everything about a biscuit from the inside. The layering, the texture, whether it had been overworked. It was all there if you knew how to look. Margaret knew how to look. She took a bite. She chewed slowly. She set the biscuit down and picked up her water. "The pudding is better than it should be with what I have in this kitchen," she said. "The beans are excellent. The brine is right, which most people get wrong." She paused. "The biscuits are the best I've had since my mother died." Clara sat with that for a moment. "I'm going to ask you something," Margaret said, "and I want an honest answer." "All right," Clara said. "Why are you still cooking for ranch hands?" It was the same question Ethan had asked her in different words, and it landed the same way, precisely in the exact place she'd been protecting. She looked at Margaret Caldwell and decided that honesty was the only currency that was going to work in this conversation. "Because it was available and I needed income," she said. "And because I didn't have anyone who believed it could be different until recently." A long silence. Margaret looked at her. Then she looked past her, briefly, toward the far end of the kitchen where Ethan was being extremely quiet. She looked back at Clara. "I'll need 72 people fed," she said. 3 courses. I want the short rib as the main. I want your biscuits on every table. I want the green beans as part of the cold first course." She stood up and smoothed her dress. "I'll have supplies ordered to your specifications by next Friday. You'll come 2 days before the event to familiarize yourself with the kitchen." Clara stood as well. "Yes," she said, "that works." Margaret looked at her directly, woman to woman, the look that contained several things at once. Respect, assessment, something that might have been recognition. "I've been running this event for 9 years," she said. "The food has always been acceptable." She paused. "I'd like it to be more than acceptable. It will be, Clara said. I want to see what else is in there. She left the kitchen. Clara stood for a moment at the table, looking at her own notebook, at the margin notes and the adjustments and the 2 years of working things out in a kitchen. Nobody noticed. Ethan came to stand near the table. He didn't say anything immediately. She liked it, Clara said, not asking. She ordered the event, he said. She doesn't do that until she's certain. Clara picked up the notebook. She was aware of her own hands, the flour on them, the specific tiredness of having cooked under pressure and having it come out right. The biscuits, she said. She said they were the best she'd had. She doesn't say things she doesn't mean, he said. I know, Clara said. That's why it... She stopped. Why it what? He said quietly. She shook her head. It was too much to explain. The specific weight of being told by a woman who meant what she said, that the thing you'd been making in a back kitchen for 2 years was the best she'd had. The way it moved something that had been sitting still for a long time. Nothing, she said. Let me see the ovens properly before we leave. I need to know about the draft. They drove back to Red Canyon in the late afternoon, the light going sideways and orange across the pale soil. And Clara sat on the wagon bench with the notebook in her lap and thought about the menu for the entire 4 hours. She thought about quantities and timing and how to manage 3 courses for 72 people with 2 days of preparation and a kitchen she was still learning. She thought about what to do if the supply order came incomplete, which it would. It always did. She thought about Gil and whether she could bring him to help, and what she would need to ask Pruitt to arrange, and how to frame it. She thought about Hank Briggs, who had been quiet since Pruitt spoke to him, but not absent, not gone, and who was the kind of man who went quiet for a reason. She thought about Margaret Caldwell saying the best I've had since my mother died. About 30 miles from Red Canyon, Ethan said, What are you thinking about? She almost said the menu. Instead, she said, Whether this is real. He looked at her. The sun was behind them now, and the light on his face was that particular end-of-day quality that made everything look more exposed than it meant to. What would make it real, he said. She thought about it. If it works, she said. If the event works and the food is right and people respond the way they should, and that leads to something after, that's when it's real. And until then? Until then, it's a good plan, she said. I don't confuse good plans with real things. It's a useful distinction. He was quiet for a moment. That's a careful way to live, he said. It's kept me intact, she said. Fair, he said. He looked back at the road. For what it's worth, I think it's real. I know you do, she said. That's useful too. He looked at her sidelong, and this time the almost smile made it all the way. She looked back at the road and thought about the menu, and the 60-mile distance between Red Canyon and where she was going collapsed a little, became something she could feel the edges of, something that had a size. 3 weeks felt both very long and very short. She opened the notebook to a fresh page and started writing before the light was completely gone, holding the book steady against the movement of the wagon, the pen moving across the page in the half-dark. She wrote, Supplies to confirm, timing for 72, oven draft. Compensate by position. Not temp. Biscuits need double batch day before. Briggs. She stared at that last word. She hadn't meant to write it. It had come out of her hand before she'd decided to put it down. She left it there. Some things you write down because you need to remember them, and some things you write because the act of writing them is the only way to admit you're worried. She had been watching Hank Briggs's particular quiet for a week now, and she knew the difference between a man who had backed down and a man who was waiting. She knew which one this was. She closed the notebook and looked at the last thin line of orange on the horizon and told herself she would deal with that when it came, and not before. The wagon moved through the darkening country, and Red Canyon was 2 hours ahead, and somewhere in those 2 hours something was waiting that she didn't yet know the shape of, but she could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives, in the quality of the air, in a pressure that hadn't been there that morning. She sat with it and let it be there, and kept the notebook closed and watched the dark come in from the east the way it always did out here, completely, with no hesitation, as if the night had been waiting all day for permission to arrive. The word Briggs stayed in the notebook for 3 days before the thing it was warning her about arrived. It came on a Wednesday, which was an ordinary Wednesday in every other respect. Cold, clear, The kind of November morning where the light came in flat and pale and made everything look harder than it was. Clara had been up since 3:45 working on the scaled timing for the Caldwell event, writing quantities in the margins next to the original recipe notes, doing the arithmetic for 72 people in her head, and then on paper, and then in her head again, because she didn't fully trust the paper when the numbers got large. She had 12 days. She knew the number, the way she knew the temperature of the oven, not by looking at it, but by feeling it, a constant background pressure that she was managing rather than worrying about, because worrying wasn't productive and managing was. Gil came in at 4:30 looking pale, which at 14 meant either he was sick again or something had frightened him. Clara looked at him once and said, "What happened?" "Nothing," he said in the voice of a person for whom something had happened. "Gil." He set the water bucket down and didn't look at her. "Briggs was talking last night," he said. "After supper, I wasn't trying to hear. I was in the supply room." Clara kept her hands moving on the bread dough. "What did he say?" Gil was quiet for a moment. He was a careful boy, the kind who weighed things before he said them, which she'd always appreciated about him. "He was talking to Taft and one other man. I didn't see who. He said—" He stopped. He picked at the edge of the work table. "He said you've been acting above your station, and that Caldwell's brought his business here and people like you shouldn't be getting ideas." She kept kneading. The dough pushed back against her hands the way dough did when it needed more time. "He said he was going to talk to Pruitt," Gil said. "Tell him that having you gone for 2 days to cook at the Caldwell Ranch was a problem, that the ranch couldn't spare you." She stopped kneading. "He said Pruitt would listen," Gil said quietly. Because he said you're just a cook, and Caldwell's already gone soft about it, and somebody needs to say the sensible thing." She stood there with her hands in the dough and looked at the far wall of the kitchen and let herself feel the specific shape of this for exactly 10 seconds. The tightness of it, the familiar grinding recognition of a thing she had navigated before in different forms, as the man who saw her moving toward something and decided, for reasons that had nothing to do with her, that she needed to be stopped. 10 seconds. Then she went back to the kneading. "All right," she said. Gil looked up. "That's all?" "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Go get the eggs." He went. She worked the dough and thought clearly about what needed to happen and in what order, the way she thought about a complicated menu. Not all at once, not with panic, but sequentially, one thing at a time, each decision following the last. She needed to talk to Ethan, not because she needed him to fix it. She was already clear on that. But because he needed to know what was moving before it arrived at Pruitt's door, and because the arrangement she was working toward required that he was not surprised by things she'd had warning about. She needed to talk to Pruitt herself, before Briggs got to him. And she needed to do both of those things before breakfast was over, which gave her approximately 2 hours. She put the bread in the oven and went to knock on the bunkhouse door. Ethan was awake. She had half expected this. He was almost always awake before the rest. And when she knocked, he came to the bunkhouse door in his jacket over his undershirt, boots not fully laced, and read her face in about 3 seconds. "Come in," he said, and stepped back. She stepped into the narrow corridor just inside the bunkhouse door, not into the main room where the other men were sleeping, and she told him what Gil had heard in 4 sentences, direct and plain. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I'll talk to Pruitt this morning." "So will I," she said. "I go first." He looked at her. "Clara, I go first," she said again. "If you go first, Pruitt hears it as you defending me, and that becomes a different conversation than the one I need to have with him. I need to talk to him about ranch operations, about the scheduling, before any of this becomes personal." She watched him process this. "You told me yourself he responds to efficiency problems. This is an efficiency problem. Let me make it that." A pause. "And if Briggs gets to him first?" "Then I deal with that," she said. "But Briggs isn't an early riser. I have time." Ethan looked at her for a moment, that steady, considering look she'd learned to read as him deciding whether his instinct to act was more useful than her judgment in a situation she understood better than he did. She watched him arrive at the correct answer. "All right," he said. "You go first, but I want to know what happens." You'll know, she said. She turned to go, then stopped. Don't say anything to Briggs, not today. What do I say if he brings it up? Nothing, she said. Men like Briggs get louder when they think they're being ignored. Let him be loud. Loud men make mistakes. She left him there and went to find Pruitt. Pruitt was at the stable, which was where he usually started his mornings, running his hand along the fence rail and looking at the horses with the particular expression of a man taking inventory in a language he understood better than any other. He heard her footsteps and didn't turn. Miss Whitmore, he said. Mr. Pruitt, she said. She stopped a few feet from him and looked at the horses too, because looking at the same thing as a man you needed something from was often better than looking directly at him. I want to talk to you about the Caldwell event. Caldwell event, he repeated, in the tone of a man who'd been told about this and hadn't formed an opinion yet, which meant he'd been told about it but hadn't been asked to have an opinion, which meant the conversation she needed to have was still available to her. Mrs. Caldwell has asked me to cook for their territorial gathering, she said. It's in 12 days. I'll need to be off the ranch for 2 days. The day before and the day of. I want to make sure the ranch is covered. Pruitt turned now and looked at her. His face was the face it always was. Weathered, contained, not hostile, but not warm. That's a long time to leave the kitchen, he said. Yes, she said. I've been thinking about how to handle it. I can prepare most of the bunkhouse meals 2 days ahead. The stew, the bread, the beans. Gil can manage the reheating if I write out the instructions. He's been watching me long enough. She paused. I also think it's worth considering what it does for the ranch's reputation. The Caldwells are the largest landholders in the territory. When Mrs. Caldwell is pleased with something, she says so, to people who matter. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. You worked this out, he said. I work things out, she said. Another moment. You're asking me to approve it. I'm telling you what I've arranged so you're not surprised, she said, which is how I prefer to operate. She watched something shift in Pruitt's expression, not warmth exactly, but a kind of recalibration. She had been at this ranch for 2 years, and she had always made sure Pruitt was not the last to know about anything she was doing, because she had told Ethan truly he hated being the last to know. She had never once surprised him with a problem. She had brought him solutions. All right, he said. Thank you, she said. She started to go. Whitmore, he said. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, assessing, but with something underneath it that might have been the grudging beginning of respect. You talked to Mrs. Caldwell herself? Sat at her kitchen table, Clara said. She tasted my cooking and gave me her requirements directly. Pruitt turned back to the horses. All right, he said again, and that was the end of it. She walked back across the yard and the cold air hit her face and she let out a breath she'd been holding without fully realizing it. She'd been at Red Canyon for 2 years, and in 2 years she'd never once asked Dade Pruitt for anything she didn't absolutely need. She'd operated within the available space and kept her head down and made herself indispensable through the food and through never causing problems. She'd built a kind of functional peace, which was not the same as respect, but was not nothing either. Now she understood what she'd actually been building. She'd been building a record. A 2-year record of reliability and competence and no surprises, and that record was what had just let her walk to that stable and have that conversation and walk away with what she needed. She thought about that. She thought about the fact that the record had always been for this, even when she hadn't known what this was. Briggs found Pruitt around 9. Clara knew because she saw them talking in the yard through the small kitchen window while she was scaling the cornbread recipe. She watched Briggs's posture, the forward lean, the gestures, the particular body language of a man making a case, and she watched Pruitt's stillness, which was different from the stillness it would have been 2 hours ago. The conversation lasted about 4 minutes. Pruitt walked away first. Briggs stood in the yard for a moment after, looking at the bunkhouse, and then he looked toward the kitchen window, and Clara was far enough back in the kitchen that she probably wasn't visible, but she didn't step back either. She looked at him, looking at the kitchen. She turned back to the cornbread calculations and wrote down the number she'd been holding in her head. At supper, Briggs was quiet again. The different quiet, the one with something moving underneath it that he was working to contain. Two of the men near him tried to start conversations, and he answered in short sentences and let the conversations die. Ethan caught her eye through the hatch. She gave him the smallest possible nod. He picked up his coffee. After supper, when the dining room had emptied and she was washing the last of the pots, she heard the kitchen door. She didn't hear a knock. She turned around. Hank Briggs was standing in the kitchen doorway, not at the threshold where men usually stopped, but inside in her kitchen, 3 feet past the door, like the space between the door and where he'd stopped didn't belong to her. She set the pot down. She was aware of the weight of it, the iron handle, the heft. She set it on the stove and turned to face him and waited. "You think you're something now," he said. "Cooking for rich people. Think that changes what you are." She looked at him. She kept her face the way she'd learned to keep it. Not blank, that was its own kind of signal, but neutral, level. The face of someone who is not afraid and is also not inviting. "I think I'm a cook," she said. "I've always thought that." "You've been filling Caldwell's head with ideas," he said, making him think a ranch cook is worth his time. "Mr. Caldwell makes his own decisions," she said. "You've been in his ear." "People talk in kitchens," she said. "That's not unusual." Briggs took another step. He was now deep enough in her kitchen that he was between her and the door, which she thought he may or may not have done deliberately. "You should understand something," he said. "Men like Ethan Caldwell come to ranches and they get interested in things, and then they go home. And whatever you think is happening here," he stopped. "Let it sit there." She looked at him directly. "I'm making food for an event," she said. "That's what's happening." "You keep telling yourself that." "Mr. Briggs," she said, and she kept her voice completely even, "you're in my kitchen. I didn't invite you in. I'd like you to leave." Something moved across his face. Not rage. She'd seen rage, and it was faster, hotter. This was slower and colder, and she liked it less than rage, because she could predict rage. "You're going to go to that event," he said, "and you're going to come back here to this kitchen, and nothing's going to be different, because that's what happens to people like you." "You should leave now," she said. He stood there for one more moment. Then he turned and walked out, and the kitchen door swung behind him, and Clara stood at the stove with her hands flat on the surface of it, pressing her palms against the warm iron, and breathed. She stood there for a full minute. Then she went back to the pot she'd been washing. Her hands were steady. She noticed this, checked for it deliberately the way you check a stove for heat, pressing her palms against the sides of the pot to feel whether they were shaking. They weren't. She'd been in enough of these moments to know the shaking, when it came afterward, when the thing was over and the body finally allowed itself to acknowledge what had just passed through it. The shaking came about 10 minutes later, just a little, just in her hands, while she was drying the last pot. She set it down and gripped the edge of the work table and waited for it to pass, which it did, because it always did. She picked up the pot and hung it on the hook and went to write in the notebook until her handwriting was steady again. She told Ethan the next morning, all of it. Briggs in the kitchen, what he'd said, where he'd stood. Ethan's face did something she hadn't seen it do before, a stillness that was not his usual stillness, the thinking kind. This was different. This was contained. "He came into your kitchen," he said. "Yes." "After hours, when you were alone?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to speak with him directly." "All right," she said. He looked at her. "You're not going to tell me not to." "No," she said. "I handled what I needed to handle. This is something else." She met his eyes. "But I want you to know something first." "What?" "Whatever you say to him, it needs to be about his behavior in this kitchen, not about me, not about whatever he thinks is happening between us." She paused. "I don't want him or anyone else thinking that I need someone to fight my battles because of a personal relationship. I've been managing Hank Briggs for months on my own, and I'll keep managing him after you leave." The last 2 words landed between them. She had said them deliberately, not cruelly, but deliberately, because they needed to be in the room. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "After I leave," he said. "You came here for a purpose that has nothing to do with me," she said. "You'll finish it and go home. I know that. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise." He was quiet. Outside the window, the first sounds of the morning ranch. Gil crossing the yard, the horses waking, the particular creak of the stable door. "What if I don't want to leave?" he said. She looked at him. "I mean that plainly," he said. "Not as a... It's not a speech. I'm telling you something true." He put his hands flat on the work table, not toward her, just flat, like he was steadying himself. "I came here to settle a business matter that I could have handled from Albuquerque. I've been here 6 weeks. I've extended twice. You know why." She held his gaze. "I have a guess," she said. "Then you know I'm not going to walk away from that," he said. "Not because of Briggs and not because of anything he thinks is or isn't happening." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove was the only sound, a low, steady burn. "I'm not a simple situation," she said. "I have plans. I have things I'm building. I'm not going to set those aside for anyone." "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to let it be real," he said. "You said, on the drive back from my family's ranch, that it would be real when the event works and the food is right and it leads to something after. I'm saying, let this be real too, at the same time." She looked at the work table, at his hands flat on the surface. She thought about what she was going to say for a long moment, not performing consideration, actually considering, thinking about what she knew and what she didn't know, and what the honest answer was. "Ask me again," she said finally. "After the event." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and went back to the bread. The confrontation with Briggs happened that afternoon, and she didn't witness it. She heard some of it. She heard the voices in the yard, Ethan's measured and low, Briggs's starting loud and then getting louder, and then a silence that lasted long enough to mean something had shifted, and then footsteps going in different directions. She heard later from Taft, who told Porter, who was apparently under the impression Clara wasn't in earshot, that Ethan had told Briggs plainly that if he entered the kitchen again without an invitation, or made one more comment directed at Clara or about Clara to anyone on this ranch, Ethan would personally see to it that Briggs was removed from the property, and that his family's relationship with this ranch's owner was sufficient to make that happen immediately, and that Briggs had said some things in response that Taft apparently didn't want to repeat, and that Ethan had stood there and let Briggs say them and hadn't raised his voice and hadn't moved from where he was standing, and when Briggs was finished, Ethan had said, "I meant what I said," and walked away. Clara listened to this account through the kitchen wall and did not react visibly and went back to her bread. She thought about what it meant that Ethan Caldwell had stood still in a yard while a man who was larger and louder than him said things Taft wouldn't repeat, and had not raised his voice and had not moved and had meant what he said. She thought about the specific kind of person that required. The 9 days before the event were the most focused she had ever been. She worked from before 4 every morning to well after dark most nights, and she worked in a way that was different from how she'd worked at Red Canyon for 2 years, not with the numbed efficiency of a person doing a job they'd stopped expecting anything from, but with the particular consuming attention of a person who is building something. She tested the biscuit batch size 4 times. She reworked the cold course twice. She had Gil drill the serving sequence until he could do it from memory, because she'd asked Margaret if she could bring him as her assistant, and Margaret had said yes with no hesitation, which told Clara that Margaret Caldwell valued preparedness over pride. Ethan helped where she asked him to and stayed out of the way where she didn't. He had learned, in the weeks he'd been at Red Canyon, the specific difference between those two things, and she appreciated it more than she said. He sourced 2 ingredients she couldn't find locally: a specific grade of dried corn and a jar of whole black peppercorns that were going to make a difference in the short rib spice, and brought them back from a trip to Albuquerque that he hadn't announced he was making and that she suspected was entirely about the ingredients, though he didn't say so and she didn't ask. He was gone for 2 days. The ranch felt different without him there, which she registered and filed away. On the 8th day, with 1 day left before she and Gil needed to leave for the Caldwell Ranch, Briggs did something she hadn't anticipated. He left. He loaded his gear onto his horse before breakfast and rode out without speaking to Pruitt, which was not how you left a ranch unless you were leaving badly. And Pruitt stood in the yard and watched him go with an expression that was unreadable at that distance. Two of the other hands watched from the stable doorway. Clara stood at her kitchen window with a coffee cup. She waited to feel something about it. Relief, triumph, the satisfaction she'd told herself she wasn't looking for. She waited, and what she felt was something more complicated and less satisfying than any of those things. She felt the specific exhaustion that comes when a threat you've been bracing against finally removes itself, and you realize how much of your energy you'd been using to hold against it. She felt the weight of that energy releasing, and beneath it, the simple tiredness of someone who had been carrying something difficult for a long time. She drank the coffee and set the cup down and went back to the biscuit batch she was testing. When Ethan came in that morning, later than usual, he'd apparently been in the yard when Briggs left. She was mid-batch, flour on her hands, and he sat at the bench and said, "You saw." "I saw," she said. "I didn't ask him to leave," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know," she said. She cut another biscuit. "That's not how those men work. They leave because they've lost the field. He decided he'd lost it." "Does that change anything for you?" She considered this honestly. "It means I can work tomorrow with my full attention on the food," she said, "instead of managing what he might do. That changes something." "Good," he said. She put the biscuits in the oven. Then she looked at him properly, the way she didn't always let herself. Just looking at him sitting at her bench in her kitchen with his coffee, the man who had been at this ranch for 6 weeks, and in that time had fixed her door and her shelf and her draft, and stood in a yard and meant what he said, and gone to Albuquerque for dried corn. "Thank you," she said. It came out simply, without the weight she would have given it if she'd planned to say it. He looked at her. "What for?" "For all of it," she said. "For the things you did that I didn't ask for, and the things you didn't do that I did ask for." She paused. "Both matter. The second one is harder." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face. Not the almost smile, not the contained expression she was most used to. Something more open than that, more direct. "I'll be there tomorrow," he said. "During the event, not in the kitchen. I know you don't need that, but I'll be there." "I know," she said. She turned back to the oven and checked the biscuits, which needed 2 more minutes, and she stood at the stove and thought about tomorrow the way she always thought about a big cook, systematically, clearly, one thing at a time. The short rib timing, the corn pudding temperature, the biscuits, double batch, prepared the night before and reheated with precision. The cold course, plated and chilled by midnight. The sequence, which she and Gil had run 4 times. She thought about 72 people sitting at Margaret Caldwell's tables, and the food she was going to put in front of them, and what it meant if it went the way she believed it would go. She thought about what Ethan had said on the wagon, "Let it be real." She pulled the biscuits from the oven. They were right, layered right, colored right. The inside she could already tell without breaking one open. She broke one open anyway, because she never stopped checking, and it was exactly what it should be. She set it on the work table and looked at it and felt for the first time in a long time that she was standing exactly where she was supposed to be standing, facing exactly the direction she was supposed to be facing. Tomorrow was real. Whatever came after tomorrow was something she would deal with when it arrived. For now, she put the biscuits to cool and went to pack her knives. She packed her knives the night before and didn't sleep much. Not from nerves exactly, or not only from nerves. It was the particular wakefulness that came before any large cook, the kind where her mind was already in the kitchen, already running the sequence, already tasting things she hadn't made yet. She'd learned not to fight it. She lay on the cot behind the curtain and let her mind work through the timing one more time while the wind moved against the bunkhouse walls, and by 2 a.m, she'd run the full sequence 3 times and found no problems she hadn't already solved, and she got up and made coffee and sat at the work table with the notebook and just looked at what she'd built. It was a real menu. She could see that clearly in the quiet of the empty kitchen, not the menu she might have imagined at 20, the ambitious, overreaching kind that tried to be everything at once, but something more honest than that. Food that knew what it was. Food that had been tested and corrected and tested again until it stopped fighting and became itself. She thought about all the mornings in this kitchen before Ethan Caldwell had walked through that door. The 4:30 wake-ups, the meals that disappeared into 30 hungry men who didn't say her name, the notebook filling up with recipes no one asked about, the draft in the corner she'd been managing with a folded flour sack. She thought about how long she'd been getting ready without knowing what she was getting ready for. Gil arrived at 3:30, punctual and pale with the particular anxiety of a 14-year-old who understood the stakes and was not quite sure he was equal to them. She put him to work immediately because idle hands and a nervous boy was a bad combination, and by 4 they had the wagon loaded and the preserved components packed in the cold box and the knives wrapped in their cloth roll and everything arranged in the order she would need it. Ethan came out at 4:15. He didn't say much, but just checked the wagon hitch while she did a final count of what was packed, and when she finished, he looked at her and said, "Ready?" "Since 3, she said. He almost smiled. He handed her up onto the wagon bench, a thing he did simply and without ceremony, and she let him, and then Gil climbed up on the other side and they pulled out of Red Canyon in the dark. The Caldwell Ranch kitchen was hers from the moment she walked into it. That was the only way to describe what happened. She walked through the door at 8 in the morning with 12 hours before service, and the kitchen became hers the way a kitchen always became hers when she thought about it long enough in advance. She moved through it once without touching anything, a full circuit, registering distances and surfaces, and the particular sound of the right oven when it was working. Then she put her knife roll on the counter and tied her apron and turned to Gil and said, "Start the fire in the left stove. I need it at temperature by 9. She worked without stopping. She had built the day's timeline to the quarter hour, and she held to it the way she held to biscuit timing. Not rigidly, because cooking was never rigid, but with the underlying discipline of someone who understood that in a service for 72 people, every 15 minutes that slipped was 15 minutes borrowed from somewhere else that couldn't spare it. The short rib went in at 9:15, which was exactly where she'd put it in the notebook. The corn pudding components were prepped and waiting. The cold course was assembled by noon and chilling in the cold box that the Caldwell kitchen had against the north wall, a permanent installation that she'd noted on her earlier visit and been thinking about since. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway at 12:30. She didn't come in. She stood at the threshold and looked at the kitchen, at the organized state of it, the components at their stages, the absence of chaos that usually characterized a large cook at this point in the day, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "How are you progressing?" "On schedule," Clara said. She was at the work table, shaping the second biscuit batch. "Cold course is done. Short rib is in the left oven. Corn pudding goes in at 2. Biscuits at 5. Margaret looked at the cold box. "Can I see the cold course?" Clara nodded at Gil, who opened the cold box and stepped back. Margaret looked. She didn't touch anything. She leaned in slightly and looked at the arrangement of plates, the pickled green beans alongside the small portion of whipped beef tallow that Clara had worked out as the spread, the herbs pressed flat against the cold surface, everything plated with the care she always brought to things nobody was going to see until they were ready to be seen. Margaret straightened up. She looked at Clara. "All right," she said, and left. It was the same all right she'd said at the end of their first conversation, and Clara understood it the same way, not as enthusiasm, but as something more durable than enthusiasm, as the acknowledgement of a woman who had seen enough to know quality when it was in front of her. She went back to the biscuits. The guests began arriving at 5, which Clara knew from the sounds, carriages in the yard, voices, the particular swell of noise that came with a gathering of people who were used to gatherings. She registered it from the kitchen and kept working. The right oven was running hot, same as Margaret had said, and she'd been compensating by rotating the pudding pans every 20 minutes, which was not ideal but was working. Gil was managing the cold course plates, which she'd arranged in the order they'd go out, and he'd been remarkably steady all day. She'd noticed this about him over the months at Red Canyon, that he was nervous before things and competent during them, which was the correct arrangement if you had to choose one. At 6:15, the first course went out. She stood at the kitchen pass and watched the plates leave and did not watch the door they went through, because watching the door was the thing you did when you weren't certain of your food, and she was certain of her food. She went back to the short rib. The short rib was right. She knew it before she tasted it, from the smell and the weight of the braising liquid when she lifted the lid, the specific layered smell of chili that had gone in at exactly the right time and worked its way into the meat the way she'd known it would, the way she'd been theorizing about in the notebook for 3 weeks before Ethan brought her the ribs to test. She tasted it anyway because you always tasted, and it was what she thought it was. She plated it herself. 72 plates with Gil beside her doing the beans and the pudding, and she put the short rib on each plate with the same attention she gave the first one as the 72nd, because she'd learned long ago that the last plate of a service was as likely to go to the person who mattered most as the first, and you never knew which person that was. The plates went out. She stood at the work table in the Caldwell kitchen with her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Then she started on the biscuits for the table baskets because they needed to be there with the main course, and she was 12 minutes ahead of schedule, and 12 minutes in a large service was a margin, not a gift. She knew the food had landed the way she'd hoped when Margaret came back to the kitchen at 7:45. Not alone this time. She had a woman with her, gray-haired, well-dressed, with the posture of someone who had spent a long time being listened to and had stopped noticing it. She stopped at the kitchen doorway and looked at Clara the way Margaret had looked at her the first time, assessingly, directly, with no particular softening. "This is Helen Voss," Margaret said. "She runs the Territorial Hotel in Santa Fe. She'd like to speak with you." Clara looked at Helen Voss. Helen Voss looked at Clara. "The short rib," Helen Voss said, without preamble. "What was the spice sequence?" Clara told her, not the full recipe, but the principle of it, the timing decision that had made the difference. Helen listened with her eyes slightly narrowed, the way a person listens when they're checking what they're hearing against what they already know. "You developed this yourself," she said. "In a ranch kitchen," Clara said, "over several weeks." "In a ranch kitchen," Helen Voss repeated, and something in her tone placed that fact next to the plate she'd eaten and sat with the distance between them. "The biscuits," she said. "How many can you produce in a single day?" Clara thought about it, not performing thought, actually calculating. "Depends on the oven," she said. "In a properly equipped kitchen, triple what I made tonight, maybe more." Helen Voss looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Clara. "I want to offer you a contract," Helen Voss said. "Catering for the hotel's private dining events. Quarterly, to start, then monthly, if the arrangement suits. I can offer you a rate." She named a figure that Clara heard and did not react to outwardly, though it was 3 times what she made at Red Canyon in a month for a single event. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at Helen Voss and thought about the contract and what it meant. The money, the access, the name that would come with cooking for the Territorial Hotel, the particular kind of door that opened from that kind of work. She thought about the notebook and the restaurant she'd been building in it for 2 years. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "I need a few days to consider it." Helen Voss looked slightly surprised, which told Clara she wasn't used to being asked to wait. "Of course," she said after a moment. "I'll write to you by the end of the week," Clara said. Helen Voss nodded. She and Margaret left, and Clara stood in the kitchen and let the silence of it settle. And then she turned to Gil, who had heard all of it and was looking at her with his mouth slightly open. "The pudding pans need washing," she said. He closed his mouth and went for the pans. But the guests were still at the tables when she finished breaking down the kitchen. She cleaned as she cooked. That was one of the things she'd built into the day's timeline, 15 minutes every 2 hours to reset the space. So the breakdown took less than an hour. She left the Caldwell kitchen in better order than she'd found it, which was a principle she'd held since she was 17 years old working in a hotel kitchen in Tucson, the first place she'd ever cooked professionally, the place that had taught her that how you left a space said something about who you were. She was wiping down the last surface when Ethan came through the kitchen door. He'd been at the dinner. She'd known he was there, had registered it the way you register a particular presence in a room even when you're focused on something else. He was still in his good jacket, the one without dust on it, and he looked like a man who'd eaten well and had been waiting to say something for a while. He looked at the kitchen, at the clean surfaces and the stacked dishes and the empty work table. "It went well," he said. It wasn't a question. "It went right," she said. He looked at her. Helen Voss was talking about the food for 40 minutes after the main course. I counted. She folded the cloth she'd been using and set it on the surface. She offered me a contract. He went still. What kind? Catering for the hotel's private dining events. Quarterly to start. She looked at him steadily. A real number. Real money. Something moved across his face. Not the almost smile, something larger than that. Something he was working to contain. What did you say? I said I'd write to her by the end of the week. Why? She looked at the notebook, sitting on the corner of the work table where she'd put it that morning. She looked at the contract in terms of what it actually was. Not the end of something, but the beginning of the specific kind of working life she'd been building toward. The one where her name was on the food, and the food was on her terms, and the money was real, and the work was worth the money. Because I needed to think, she said, about what I actually want, not what's being offered, what I want. He was quiet. He walked to the work table and put his hands on the edge of it, the same way he'd done that morning in the Red Canyon kitchen when he'd told her he didn't want to leave. He was a man who grounded himself physically when he was saying something that mattered. She'd noticed this over the weeks, the way he put his hands flat on surfaces, like he needed to feel solid ground under the important words. What do you want? He said. She picked up the notebook. She turned it over in her hands once, feeling the cover, the weight of it, the 2 years of mornings in it. The hotel contract is a beginning, she said. It's income and a name and access. I take it, but it's not the restaurant. She set the notebook down. The restaurant is still the thing. I know, he said. I need my own kitchen, she said. My own tables, my own menu, my name on the door, my decisions about who gets served and what it costs and what it looks like. She paused. I know what that requires. I know it takes capital I don't have yet, and time I haven't had yet, and I'm not asking you for anything. I want to be clear about that. This is what I want. I'm just saying it clearly. I know you're not asking me for anything, he said. You never ask for anything. That's not entirely true, she said. I asked Pruitt about the schedule. I asked Margaret if I could bring Gil. That's different, he said. That's logistics. I mean, you don't ask for what you actually need. She looked at him. He was right, and they both knew he was right, and she wasn't going to argue it. I'm working on that, she said. He nodded. He picked up the notebook from the work table, not reading it, just holding it the way she'd been holding it. I want to tell you something, he said, and I want you to hear it as information, not as pressure. All right, she said. There's a property in town, he said. Closest town to the ranch, you know which one. A building that's been empty for 8 months. It was a restaurant, failed because the man who ran it was bad with money and good at nothing in the kitchen. The building is sound. The kitchen equipment is still there. He set the notebook down. I've been thinking about it since you told me about the restaurant. I had it looked at 3 weeks ago. She stared at him. The owner is willing to sell at a reasonable price, he said. Reasonable meaning, not beyond what could be arranged between the hotel contract money coming in and other options. He paused. I'm not offering to buy it for you. I want to say that clearly. I'm telling you it exists. What you do with that information is entirely yours. She stood very still. She thought about a building in town with a working kitchen and 8 months of emptiness in it waiting for someone who knew what to do with a kitchen. She thought about the hotel contract money and what she could build on top of it. She thought about the notebook and whether the restaurant in it could be a real place with a real address and a real door with her name on it. She thought about the fact that this man had gone and had a building looked at 3 weeks ago, quietly, without mentioning it. Not as a surprise or a gesture or a thing to hold over her, but simply as information he thought she should have when she was ready for it. You had it looked at, she said. I wanted to know if it was sound, he said. It is. 3 weeks ago. Yes. Before the event. Before the event, he said. I wasn't going to tell you before the event because you had enough to think about. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what kind of person sits on a piece of information for 3 weeks because the timing matters to the other person more than to them. She thought about all the things he'd done and not done, and the difference between those two things, and how he'd understood without being told which was which. I want to see it, she said. I'll arrange it, he said. After I write to Helen Voss, she said. after I accept the contract and have a starting number. Yes, he said. She put the notebook in her bag. She looked at the kitchen, clean, ordered, hers for one day and not hers anymore. She thought about a kitchen that would be hers every day. Hers to order and disorder and fix and break in and learn over years until she knew every hot spot and every draft and every particular thing it needed from her. You asked me, she said, on the drive back from this ranch the first time. You said, let it be real. This and the restaurant at the same time. He waited. I'm letting it be real, she said. Both of them. He looked at her. The kitchen was quiet, and the sounds of the gathering were distant, and the lamp on the work table made a small, specific light between them. Good, he said. It came out rougher than his usual voice, less contained, and she recognized that as honesty, which was what she'd learned to value most in him. What? She wrote to Helen Voss on Friday. She wrote the letter herself, at the Red Canyon kitchen table before breakfast, in the early quiet that she'd always kept for herself. And she wrote it plainly and accepted the contract and named 2 conditions: her right to develop the menus independently, and first right of refusal if the hotel moved toward an exclusive arrangement. Helen Voss wrote back within the week, agreeing to both. She saw the building on a Saturday in December, 3 weeks after the Caldwell event. Ethan drove her. The town was called Red Start, small, functional, on the stage road, the kind of town that had a general store and a telegraph office, and a population that was growing slowly, but growing. The building was on the main street, wood frame, 2 rooms facing the street and a kitchen in the back that was larger than it looked from outside. She walked through it the way she'd walked through the Caldwell kitchen, one full circuit without touching anything. She opened the oven. She looked at the flue. She stood at the window that faced the back alley and thought about deliveries. Well, Ethan said from the doorway. She turned around. The kitchen's too small, she said. He blinked. The front room is fine. The second room could be expanded into dining. But the kitchen, I'd need to take out the back wall and extend it by 10 feet. She looked at the wall in question. Is that possible with this structure? He looked at the wall. I'd need a builder to look at it. There's a load-bearing consideration on the east side, she said, but the south wall is partition, I think. If the south wall is partition, the extension is straightforward. He looked at her. Something on his face that she'd come to recognize. That specific quality of attention he gave her when she said something that confirmed something he'd already believed. I'll get a builder out here Monday, he said. I also want to know about the water access, she said, and the alley drainage. I'll find out. She went back to the kitchen. She stood in the center of it and turned slowly, looking at what was there and what wasn't there, and what could be made from the combination of those 2 things. She thought about the first morning Ethan Caldwell had sat at her bench in the Red Canyon kitchen and read her notebook and asked, "What are you waiting for?" Not what obstacles are in your way. What are you waiting for? She had not fully understood the distinction then. She understood it now. The obstacles had been real. Money, access, a world that didn't hand kitchens to women who cooked for ranch hands. Those things were real, and she'd had to move through them, and she would have to keep moving through them. But under all of that, underneath every practical barrier, had been the thing she was waiting for inside herself. The permission to believe it was possible, the willingness to let it be real. That had been the actual obstacle, and it had been hers to move, not anyone else's. Clara, Ethan said. She turned. He was still in the doorway, and the December light was coming in flat through the front windows, and he looked like himself, tired from the drive, honest-faced, the man who had shown up at a remote ranch and knocked on a kitchen door and asked for coffee and meant thank you when he said it. It's the one, she said. He looked around the building. You're sure? I'm sure, she said. Get the builder. Find out about the south wall. I need to talk to Helen Voss about the timeline before I commit to a purchase date, because the hotel contract income affects what I can do and when, she paused. And I want the deed in my name. Of course, he said. I mean that specifically, she said. My name only. I want to build this myself. He held her gaze. I know, he said. I wouldn't have it any other way. She believed him. She believed him because she'd been watching him for 2 months and had learned that he was, at his core, a man who understood the difference between helping and taking over, and who had the particular discipline to hold to that difference even when taking over would have been easier. That was not a common thing. She had stopped pretending it was. The restaurant opened in the following September. 9 months from the day she stood in the empty building in December. 9 months of planning and building and fighting the particular small battles that came with being a woman with her name on a deed in 1883 New Mexico territory. There were battles. She did not pretend there weren't. The builder who had to be replaced because he thought her extension plans were wrong and found out they were right. The supplier who gave her a different price than he'd quoted until she arrived in person with the written quote and did not leave until the correct price was honored. The 2 men in town who referred to the restaurant in its first weeks as Caldwell's Place, which she corrected every time she heard it, calmly and directly, until they stopped. Ethan was there for most of it. He'd moved back to Albuquerque in January to manage his family's business as he'd always intended, but he came to Red Start often, more often than the distance easily justified, and she stopped pretending she didn't know why and let that be what it was. They had a conversation in February, in the unfinished restaurant with the sound of the builder's crew working on the south wall extension, where she told him plainly that she was not going to be anyone's secret or anyone's project, and that if he was going to be in her life, it was going to be in plain sight, and she was going to keep building her restaurant, and he was going to have to decide whether that was the arrangement he actually wanted. He said, "Yes, that's exactly the arrangement I want." She said, "You should be sure." He said, "Clara, I've been sure since about the 3rd morning I sat at your bench." She thought about that. She thought about the 3rd morning, the short rib conversation, the way he'd asked, "What are you waiting for?" and meant it as a real question rather than a rhetorical device. She said, "All right." They were not easy together in the way of people who want the same easy things. She was stubborn and direct and did not forgive inefficiency, and he was accustomed to making decisions alone and had to learn, with some friction, that her kitchen was her kitchen and her decisions were her decisions, and being right was not the same as being helpful. They argued about the restaurant's pricing, about the menu for the first season, about a supplier he'd recommended and she'd rejected for reasons she'd explained clearly and he'd initially resisted. They worked through it. It was not smooth and it was not effortless, which was fine, because Clara had long suspected that effortless meant one of the 2 people had stopped saying what they thought. The restaurant opened on a Tuesday, because Tuesdays were not special, and she didn't want a special day. She wanted an ordinary day that became significant because of what happened in it. 73 people came to the restaurant on the first Tuesday. She hadn't expected that many, and was short 2 tables and had to borrow chairs from the building next door, which annoyed her considerably, because she did not like being unprepared, and she was already planning the correction before the first service was half done. Margaret Caldwell was there. She'd come from the ranch with 2 other women from the territorial gathering, and she sat at the best table, a corner with the afternoon light. And she ordered everything and ate everything, and when Clara came out of the kitchen at the end of the service, Margaret was still at the table, and she looked at Clara across the room with that same direct, assessing gaze she'd turned on her in October. And she said, at a volume designed to be heard by the table around her and the table after that, "Best meal I've eaten in this territory." Clara said, "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell." Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she said, more quietly, in the tone she used when she was saying something she meant privately rather than publicly, "You should have been doing this years ago." "Yes," Clara said. "I should have." Margaret nodded. She picked up her coffee. There is something that is hard to explain about watching a person who has been invisible become visible. Not because they changed. Clara Whitmore did not change in any fundamental way between the morning Hank Briggs knocked her platter to the floor, and the Tuesday she opened her restaurant. She was the same woman. Same stubbornness, same standards, same handwriting in the same notebook, same instinct for when the chili needed to wait. What changed was the room around her. What changed was who was looking. And the difficult human truth in that is this: the room doesn't change on its own. Clara didn't wait for it to change. She did the specific, unglamorous work of building a record over 2 years. And then she did the harder work of letting herself believe the record meant something. And then she did the hardest work of all, which was saying out loud what she wanted and accepting help without giving up the thing the help was for. None of it was clean, none of it arrived without cost. She had spent 2 years in a kitchen nobody saw, cooking food nobody thanked her for, and she could have spent 10 more years that way, and it would have been no one's fault but the particular grinding weight of a world that doesn't notice the person behind the door until someone makes the world look. But she also could have stayed in that kitchen forever and called it safety, and she had almost done that, and she knew it. Ethan Caldwell had not rescued her. He had knocked on the kitchen door and asked for coffee, and listened when she talked and fixed the things that needed fixing and told her the building existed when she was ready to hear it. He'd been present in the particular way that mattered, not instead of her, but alongside her, steady in the places where she was steady, and honest in the places where she was not. She thought about this sometimes, in the early mornings of the restaurant's first year, when she was up before anyone else, and the kitchen was hers, and quiet, and she was in the particular state of mind that the early morning always brought, clear, without the noise of the day's demands, close to the thing underneath all the doing. She thought, the best thing anyone did for me was notice me without needing me to be smaller than I was. She thought, I nearly didn't let him. She wrote those two things in the notebook, not as recipes, not as timing notes, but just as words on a page, the way you write something when you want to remember not the event, but what the event taught you about yourself. The restaurant ran for 11 years under her name. It went through a kitchen fire in its 3rd year that cost her the south wall extension and 3 months of revenue, and she rebuilt it and extended the kitchen further than before, which she'd been wanting to do since the first week. It went through a drought that hit the territory in its 7th year and reduced her supply options severely, and she adjusted the menu and kept the tables full by doing what she'd always done, cooking what was available with the full attention of a person who never decided that good enough was sufficient. Ethan ran his family's business from Albuquerque and came to Red Start and came back, and they built something together that was not a rescue story and not a love story in the uncomplicated way of stories that end before the hard years start. It was a partnership between two people who were both difficult in their own ways and who had, across a long time, decided that the difficulty was worth it. They married in the restaurant's 2nd year on an ordinary Wednesday in the presence of Margaret Caldwell and Gil, who was 16 by then and had become Clara's first proper kitchen employee and would eventually become her head cook, and a small group of people from Red Start who had already begun to understand that this restaurant was something worth attending to. On their last morning at Red Canyon, the morning before they left for Red Start for the last time, Clara went into the kitchen before anyone was up and stood in the center of it. The stove she'd learned to read by feel, the work table with its scars, the small window that faced the yard, which was gray in the early light, the horses moving at the edge of it. She looked at it all carefully. She wanted to remember it, not with bitterness, not with relief, but with the clarity you owe the places that made you. She had been unhappy here. She had also built everything that came after here, in this room, in the mornings before anyone was awake, in the notebook that had moved with her from the cot behind the curtain to the kitchen of a restaurant with her name on the door. The draft was gone. The shelf was still straight. The door swung clean. She turned off the lamp and picked up her bag and walked out of the Red Canyon kitchen for the last time. And the door closed behind her without a sound, and she crossed the yard in the first gray light of morning and did not look back, because everything she was carrying with her was already ahead of her, waiting, the way it always had been. The notebook was in her bag.